that feel really unusual and challenging and difficult. But try and hold on to the fact that the kinds of behaviours and difficulties we're talking about, what I'm going to give to you and try to sell to you is that however strange or difficult or challenging they feel, they mean something and they've come from somewhere and they can be made sense of when you think about the people who are exhibiting those kinds of behaviours. They're not things that just appear, they're things that kind of have their own developmental history. It's very much what today's going to be about. So as we do that, you're going to have to kind of maybe challenge various things in yourself about what might be a useful behaviour for someone, because that's what I'm going to try and argue to you, that we think about something like personality disorder, which can encompass all sorts of quite difficult behaviours to get your head around, to understand. I want you to try and bear in mind that perhaps for the people doing those behaviours, they have a function and a purpose. And they can have a function and a purpose, and they can even give that person maybe some kind of advantages in some ways, but that doesn't stop them being really difficult and distressing for that person as well. They can be both at once, yeah? They can help someone in some ways, and they can protect someone in some ways, but then in other ways, they can do that person a lot of harm, and the people around them a lot of harm. So try and hold on to that as a kind of way forward. I'm not going to next week that feel really unusual and challenging and difficult. But try and hold on to the fact that the kinds of behaviours and difficulties we're talking about, what I'm going to give to you and try to sell to you is that however strange or difficult or challenging they feel, they mean something and they've come from somewhere and they can be made sense of when you think about the people who are exhibiting those kinds of behaviours. They're not things that just appear, they're things that kind of have their own developmental history. It's very much what today's going to be about. So as we do that, you're going to have to kind of maybe challenge various things in yourself about what might be a useful behaviour for someone, because that's what I'm going to try and argue to you, that we think about something like personality disorder, which can encompass all sorts of quite difficult behaviours to get your head around, to understand. I want you to try and bear in mind that perhaps for the people doing those behaviours, they have a function and a purpose. And they can have a function and a purpose, and they can even give that person maybe some kind of advantages in some ways, but that doesn't stop them being really difficult and distressing for that person as well. They can be both at once, yeah? They can help someone in some ways, and they can protect someone in some ways, but then in other ways, they can do that person a lot of harm, and the people around them a lot of harm. So try and hold on to that as a kind of way forward. I'm not going to lectures directly map onto the assessment, so the idea is if you're able to do these things, there's going to be no surprises to you at the exam. You don't have to even question spot anymore for my stuff. You can just think, right, these are the learning outcomes, so this is what he's going to want in a basic answer. And you'll see, those of you who printed out the handout, I've done this thing now where I've suggested core and extra kind of homework activities. And the core activities you need to do to hit the learning outcomes. With the additional activities, you can kind of do those if you just want to go further. And obviously you'll get more marks than in the exam, but you don't have to do that. Those won't be things asked for in the exam. So let's start off then. We're going to talk about this thing called attachment today to start with. I want to do attachment quite quickly so we can get on to personality disorder. Attachment and personality disorder, this is where you're going to have to suspend any kind of concrete thinking. Attachment we talk about with children, personality disorder we talk about with adults. I'm not arguing today that attachment disorders lead to personality disorders. I'm going to touch on some evidence that they may do, but we're not going to go there. Instead, I want to think about attachment as a way of describing the behaviour of children who have particular problems with social relationships. And then I'm going to go on to get you to think about how ideas of attachment might help you understand these things called the personality disorders that we'll then do in the second half of the lecture. So let's start with attachment, probably a term you've kind of all heard of. So originally this thing came about with babies. I'll just go through this quick. I talk about this stuff all day, so who cares about the handout? The way this kind of stuff was arranged are the kind of things, this is just Bowlby's language, this is just a way of talking about this stuff, yeah, these aren't kind of facts, they're just ideas. I think they're ideas that do fit, stuff we actually know quite a lot. So these are various things Bowlby suggested. He suggested these things called affectional bonds, which is kind of like a special relationship basically, a fancy psychological word for that. But when you have this affectional bond, you kind of want to stay close to someone. I know this stuff sounds really obvious, but it's all going to make more sense in a minute. And then, so affectional bond is like a special relationship where you want to be close to somebody. Attachment then is a very special version of an affectional bond. The thing that makes an attachment different from just wanting to be close to somebody and having a close emotional relationship is Bowlby argued that in attachments, your very sense of kind of security as a person is bound up in that relationship. So, for example, with a baby doesn't just have bonds with people around. Obviously it has very special relationships, but the point being is certainly while it's developing, its very kind of sense of self is bound up in those relationships, which is maybe why babies respond so badly when they're left by themselves, for instance. Because, you know, it's enormous primitive anxiety generated by being left by themselves. How do they make sense within that relationship? And without the relationship, their security isn't there. And it doesn't make sense when you think about little children. So then, attachment behaviours. This is what we're going to talk about a lot today. So attachment behaviours are specific behaviours which kind of facilitate an attachment occurring. So they are things that one can do to keep that person close to you when you're able to kind of experience that sense of security. So with babies, there's all the stuff like eye contact and smiling from that early age draws people into relationships. How can you not smile back at the baby that smiles at you? Interestingly, before a baby smiles, like some people find that quite challenging, like interacting with a baby who doesn't really do much back. But then as soon as that smile starts, the relationship kind of moves on to that next level and you're kind of drawn close together. Also things like touching, but then, I want to use the word negative, but then there's behaviours like this, like clinging on to someone or crying if someone leaves them. These are behaviours, but they're behaviours that usually would make an adult with a baby kind of go back and pick the baby up. So this is an attachment behaviour. A baby can cry, and in that way you can get the person they are attached to come and kind of attend to them and kind of restore their sense of security. So it's like thinking about all of this stuff in relationships, thinking about the function of these kind of behaviours and what they actually do to the adults around the baby and so forth. What they do is they kind of draw people into linking dyads or triads, you know, like 2 or 3 people interaction, in a way that then can make that baby feel secure. So these are kind of, I'm just sort of giving this for info really, but hold on to this thing about attachment behaviour. The idea that you might be able to do things to keep people close to you. Because that's going to get kind of important later. This is something I've kind of given you some additional reading around, so I'm not going to spend long on it. But the idea is, and I've hinted at it already, that these kind of attachments develop through kind of like a developmental trajectory. So in other words, a baby isn't born doing all this stuff, the adult isn't like right there with those things already formed. They kind of form from the developing relationship over the first few weeks and months. So Bowlby talks about phases. He talks about the first phase, you know, from like 4 6 weeks where a baby's not doing right much. They might look at you a bit, they don't even really smile at you, you know, they just kind of do their thing. But obviously, at that point, I mean, we can talk about this being non-intentional, their behaviours, reflexes and looks and all the rest of it. But for the parents around that baby, I don't think this is necessarily fair to call this stuff non-intentional, because parents make sense of their baby's behaviour. Like on the first film, you can find videos, for some reason, Americans love putting videos on YouTube with their newborn babies, okay? Find one of those videos and have a look and watch how they talk to these kids of theirs. I was looking at one for HSS 113 the other day, with a baby just 1 day old, and already at just 1 day, this kid still had a little kind of like thing in his hand, and he was like with his little bands on, and he was still in hospital, but his behaviour was being responded to as if intentional by his parents. So I think at one point he did a reflective hand opening his desk, hi, you know, treating it as a wave. It was really like, interesting. And if you said to the parent, do you think he really meant that? Why don't you think the parent would have thought one way or the other? They probably would have said, well, no, I don't think it did mean that. But in that sort of developing relationship, it did have a meaning. So the idea is, this is how it starts. It starts with parents interpreting. And then from about 3 months, actually younger really, babies start doing much more intentional stuff. So it's not just that they cry as a reflex, they start being able to cry in response to something a parent's done, kind of knowing that something particular will happen afterwards. So my little Madeline, who's 5 months, now if you put her down for a nap in the day, she hates naps in the day. She knows it's coming, you kind of carry her up to her bedroom, and she'll be sort of quite happy, and then you come near the cot, and she'll be like, oh, and then you put her down, and she's like, ah, and it's like a really like intentional cry, yeah? I'm not saying she isn't upset, but it isn't like the cries of little babies. It's a cry that says, actually, I'm pretty annoyed with you, you just put me down. And then, well, we try not to respond, of course, in that way, because people must have a nap and all the rest of it. But this is kind of an important thing to think, yeah, that it becomes more intentional. And then this brings us to then from 6 months, what Bowlby called the secure base behaviours. Now this is the really important bit for attachment theory. He argued that at 6 months, babies begin to invest themselves in a relationship. And this is sort of true, okay, because little Madeline, she's 5 months and she cries when we put her down. But really, any adult would do for Madeline, okay? As much as that breaks my heart, you can pass her around the room and she just loves everybody. It's just showtime as far as she's concerned. She would be fine with any adult who could meet her needs. But from 6 months, there is a definite shift, and that stops. If you start giving babies then to people they don't know, the lip comes out, the trembling begins. They're a much less happy little baby when they're not with their particular caregiver or caregivers or community. If it's a culture where much more sensibly it's community who cares for a baby, the secure base can attach to an individual more than an individual. But if it's someone outside of that secure base, you start getting the anxiety behaviours. So something definite happens around 6 months. And this kind of coincides, as I say, with like what we call social anxiety behaviours in babies. Stranger anxiety, separation anxiety. These are terms you'll have come across. But the point is you don't get those before 6 months. So something definite happens. And Bowlby argued, well, that is evidence then. That at that point, the baby's very sense of security and kind of emerging sense of self is invested in relationships with particular people or groups of people rather than others. So you can kind of read more about that, but what I want to get across is this is something that emerges over time. But from 6 months, something very special appears to happen. I'm just going to look at you now. Some of you may know the answer to this. Come up by someone called Mary Ainsworth. I recommend after the lecture, just go on YouTube, type in strange situation test, and you find a nice video of it. And all of your anxieties about, is this a fair thing to do to babies? When you watch that video, you would think, oh well, obviously that doesn't really matter, because yes, there are people out there who have come up with this test that involves separating babies from a caregiver and kind of seeing what happens. And that's how it's tested. This specific situation set up where a baby's with their kind of secure base, and then the secure base leaves the room and leaves the baby either with a stranger or by themselves, and you see what the baby does. And then the secure base comes back in, and you see what the baby does again, and you kind of repeat it. And of course, the baby cries. I mean, the baby cries inevitably. Whatever stage they're at in their development of attachment, they cry. That is a normal thing for babies to do at that point. It's kind of quite a horrible thing to watch, but it's worth watching. What's interesting about this is it is given, as this test, this procedure, has given quite a lot of weight to some of these arguments about attachment. It has allowed people to think more carefully about what different forms of attachment children might demonstrate. And we're going to talk about that a little bit now. So there's a discussion in the literature of modes of attachment. These are different styles of attachment you find amongst different children when tested on this strange situation thing. So usually strange situation tests in the classical literature is done 12 to 18 months. We're talking about little kids here being separated and put back, separated and put back. And what you find is about 2/3 of those kids basically do similar things. So let's just hold on to this here. 2/3. Only 2/3 kind of do similar things. So that's kind of important if we're talking about any kind of disorder here. We need to be a bit careful. But for 2/3 of children, we talk about them having a secure attachment. So what a secure attachment basically means is the parent leaves the room and they cry, parent or secure base returns, and they're upset but they get calmed down quite quickly, and they'll go to that secure base for some kind of affection or so to try and make them feel better. So you would hope with a securely attached child that they would cry, and then when the person comes back in, they'd go over to that person and the room, and they'd have a cuddle and it'll kind of be alright. And that's what is very familiar with seeing probably with child-parent interaction. Now some children might cry a lot more, some children might cry less, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a secure attachment. The crucial thing actually is what happens at reunion. As long as that baby, child, seems to go to the parent for reassurance and get reassured, you would say yes, there is a secure attachment between these people. But then a third, so this is why you need to be careful in terms of talking about a disorder. I don't think we're talking about disordered children here. We're talking about a pretty big minority of children. Don't do those kind of things. They don't behave in that same way. And we talk about this as an insecure attachment. Having an insecure attachment is not like a death sentence. It doesn't mean in your head you have an insecure attachment that will be there forever and cause you problems through your life. I mean, it may or may not mean that. We're talking about a third of all children here. So this is a lot of children don't behave in that way. But what it does probably tell us in those insecurely attached children is something about the nature of their relationship with their secure base, and this is what's important. There's three kind of subgroups we can talk about. The ambivalent group, the anxious avoidant group, and the disorganised group. I'll go through these first two quite quickly because these are the ones that aren't really worrying actually. These are the ones that, okay, it's not a secure attachment, but it doesn't necessarily mean too much if you have an ambivalent or an anxious avoidant child. Ambivalent children, what they do when they're separated is they cry, and then when the parent comes back in, or secure base comes back in, they carry on crying, but what they don't really do is kind of go to the parent for reassurance in the same way you'd expect. They might kind of crawl up to the parent, but then they sort of reject the parent. That's the idea of ambivalence. They kind of want the parent, but they don't want the parent at the same time. It actually seems quite angry when you see that sort of child. It feels like the child is angry at the parent. I know that's a reading, but it's what it looks like. So the baby crawl over and the parent trying to pick up, no, kind of fighting them off. And it's really strange, sort of like this conflict. That is ambivalence. So an ambivalent, insecurely attached child does that. An anxious avoidant one, kind of similar, but they just completely ignore the parent. There's no ambivalence. There's no going over for a cuddle and then not wanting it. There's kind of just nothing. So they might even still cry when the parent leaves the room, but when the parent or secure base comes back, there's just nothing. They just carry on doing what they're doing. Now both of these are not necessarily problems, but they can, but not always, be associated, or some kind of evidence actually, that perhaps there's not that much contact within that parent-child relationship. Now this is not always, please don't take me at face value on this, but sometimes the children who have these kinds of behaviours, it is indicative that within that child's relationship at home with their parent, there's actually kind of a lack of contact, a lack of kind of affectional bond. There's less of that than you would expect. But not always. Kids are kids, they respond differently. But these still will be talked about in terms of insecure. The third one is different, disorganised attachment, which is actually just this catch-all category for children who behave in ways that don't fit into the top three. It's far fewer children. What? Can we keep going with the lights off or what? I don't know what that means. Where are the light switches? I didn't do anything, I promise. That was a bit weird. Okay, let me just turn this one off over here. Okay, good. So, disorganised attachment. Now, what's difficult about disorganised attachment? So these are kids who demonstrate much more unusual behaviours at reunion. They do things at reunion that are less obviously about being upset or ignoring your parent. They're kind of about something else. And this kind of says it all, that 80% of babies who are known to have suffered abuse, because the thing is with babies, if they can't talk, so many babies probably suffer abuse and we never know about it. But when we do know about it, so when there's been some serious stuff going off in that family, and perhaps the baby no longer is with their biological parents, 80% of them demonstrate disorganised attachment. What disorganised attachment really seems to be about is about a baby or a child who either finds their caregiver to be frightened or frightening. So in other words, they either, when the caregiver comes in, they look at the caregiver's face and they see fear in that face. That's a very hard thing to deal with, we'll talk about that in a minute. Or where they are actually frightened of that caregiver because of things that caregiver's done. Now, both of those situations put the baby in a really difficult place. The argument from this kind of way of thinking is you have a baby that biologically has a propensity to relate, a baby who kind of knows that they should be going to a caregiver for some kind of reassurance, but they're scared of the caregiver, or they look at the caregiver and they see fear in the caregiver's face. That's kind of creates this conflict. You've got, on one hand, you're wanting to go to somebody to make you feel better, on the other hand, you're scared of the person. So what kind of things do babies do? A common disorganised attachment behaviour is just completely freezing, actually, and doing nothing. So they go completely like that when they see their caregiver. And that kind of makes sense in terms of, well, what do? They're in conflict. On one hand they want to go, on the other hand they're scared, or see fear, and they're not going to go. But then other disorganised attachment behaviours are, on the surface, even more idiosyncratic, but they make a lot more sense. They make a lot of sense when you think about it. So some little babies, well, toddlers, who have these kind of difficulties, particularly ones who've been abused, do things, for instance, like walking towards their caregiver but looking away, like that. Or even actually walking backwards towards their caregiver. I mean, you think, well, that's a bit strange. But actually, for me, there's something unbelievably kind of powerful about that as an indication of the level of conflict these kids must be under, the kids who've been through these experiences. They want to walk towards their caregiver, but they can't bear to look at them, is kind of what we're saying. Very challenging stuff to think about. Disorganised attachment, though, is associated with quite poor outcomes in terms of mental health. And it isn't necessarily because these kids have a disorganised attachment in their head, but it probably speaks of the kind of depth and complexity and distress of experience that these kids have been through to get to the point where at 12 to 18 months they're behaving like this. And I'm kind of trying to get at this all the way. You should think about all this stuff, though, not in terms of people having an attachment in their head. I mean, people have made these arguments before, but I think it's easier to think about all of these kind of behaviours as being some kind of adaptive functional response to a very difficult caregiver-child relationship. Children are social beings. They come up with their own ways of solving emotional problems. All of us have ways of solving emotional problems, some of which are functional, some of which are less functional. Babies are people as well. So all of these behaviours can be thought about in those terms. And certainly some children may only demonstrate these with some adults, for instance. Kids who get as far as disorganised attachment patterns, they tend to have problems with all adults around them, actually, different sorts of problems. You can probably understand why when you think about some of the experiences they might have been through. And you can read it yourself. Because there's a bit of homework around this, but there is quite a lot of work about long-term trajectory with all this stuff, thinking about, well, what does an attachment disorder mean for kind of an adult's well-being? None of this stuff is determined, yeah? If you've got these problems when you're a child, it does not necessarily mean you will have problems as an adult, but there do seem to be some associations. But what I want to do now for the second half is talk personality disorder. And I'm not saying that personality disorder and attachment disorder just go together, or that attachment disorder always leads to personality disorder, or any of the rest of it. Instead, I want to use the thinking we've done about attachment and attachment behaviours to try and understand what are a very distressing set of diagnoses. They don't really fit, actually, talking about diagnosis at all. Let's forget that. You can be diagnosed with personality disorder. Let's instead think of these as kind of states. They are ways of being that some people get into. Chronic, distressing, very, very difficult stuff when we think about people who can become diagnosed with personality disorder. And to get started, I now want you to spend just 1 minute thinking about this. You can talk to people around you about it, or you may not feel comfortable doing so. We've all had experiences of relationships in this room, I'm sure, that are not so good relationships. Relationships that are filled with insecurity. It might be us being insecure, or the other person being insecure, or both of us being insecure. It can work all those ways. In your experiences, just have a think, and you won't have to give this as feedback. What attachment behaviours are associated with insecure adult relationships? I'm not talking about pathological ones, but just think of your own experiences of social, intimate relationships. What kind of behaviours do people do, or have you found yourself doing, which you think are about insecurity, about trying to keep that person close when perhaps things aren't working out? I'll give you just a minute to think about that. Now that doesn't matter. This is normal. Humans are complex. Humans aren't perfect. Humans do all sorts of things that in retrospect they wish they hadn't done. That is life. We're not talking about this stuff. What we're talking about with personality disorder is when this stuff goes to the next level, where it is so ingrained and so part of someone's being that all of their social relationships are tied up in insecure behaviours, very insecure behaviours. So some of the stuff we're going to talk about now towards the end might be stuff that individuals find personally challenging, but it's important that we do talk about this as it is, because this is the reality of these kind of issues. People who get these diagnoses have really, really big issues in their life. Now here's a case study. This is real. It's like heartbreaking. I mean, it's something that even trying to talk about it now, it brings tears to my eyes. This is a real person who I was involved in this study in my last job where we were doing kind of research in mental health services, and we were just trying to map like people's service use history, kind of just their histories, just their lives through services. I mean, I think of myself as a man of the world, but some of the stories that you hear are just unbelievable. And this is one that really stuck with me. This was she's only 18, this girl, who was 18, and at 5 years, anyway, okay, so this is the story. She was adopted at 5, after there'd been this disclosure that there was kind of a huge amount of abuse within this large extended family. It was one of these really squalid situations that don't get talked about very much, but happen, I think, more than you would think, where you get extended kind of families involved in horrifying kind of issues around abuse. So she was adopted away at 5. Now, in our culture, we talk about adoption as if it's kind of all right. This is something that seems to happen quite a lot. Like, people say, oh yeah, the child got adopted, it's kind of fine. And you think, well, okay. But actually, the fact of the matter is, adoption isn't all Tracy Beaker, let's put it that way. Many children adopted are okay, but many have had pretty dreadful things happening to them. In fact, to be adopted, you have to have had something awful happen to you. You have to have been in a position where your parents, for whatever reason, can no longer look after you. And in our culture, that is a huge deal. Don't underrate it for a moment. So many people who are adopted have significant problems through their lives, as do those who are fostered. So this kid was then referred to child and adolescent mental health, repeatedly referred. This is the story with these kinds of individuals. Referred, back round and round services. So at 7, 9 and 10, she was having various behavioural issues at school, outward behavioural issues, so hitting people, biting, spitting, that kind of stuff. At 12 then, she began significant alcohol misuse and self-injurious behaviour, so really self-injurious behaviour, really kind of, we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute actually. And then it got to the point that in 2 years, between 13 and 15, she attended A&E 60 times in 2 years due to cutting. So now, self-cutting, okay? Again, many of you may find this challenging, but I think we need to look at cutting in its cultural context. Lots of people cut without necessarily it being a problem along these lines that we're talking about here. I mean, for my parents' generation, my parents were born in the 50s, the idea of cutting yourself is horrendously taboo, as would actually be the idea of being kind of diagnosed with depression, as would, as I found out when I was 19, getting your tongue pierced. That caused a lot of problems. But for that generation, kind of very, very difficult. But I think nowadays we need to look, cutting is kind of mainstream. Some people cut and it isn't a problem. But there's cutting and there's cutting. And this kid was cutting so badly, she was having to go A&E, round and round. At 15, and this is the kind of challenges with adoption, this kid then reinitiated contact with the family she'd been adopted out of. Now the amount of loyalty, think about that as a 5-year-old, think about 5-year-old you've met, being taken from your family for whatever reason and put elsewhere, leaves all kinds of ambivalence and mixed feelings. Even if that family was hurting you, they're still your family. And this is not uncommon, that when these kids hit teenage years, they try and re-engage contact with often their abusers from when they were younger. And in that situation, the adoptive placement collapsed. So at 15, this girl then went into local authority care. And then, this is kind of when things get really difficult. At 16, she tried to kill herself in a way that is not uncommon, actually, with these kind of people. She tried to set herself on fire, like in a care home. And what happens when people do that, and you might find this shocking, is they're actually usually prosecuted for arson. So she tried to kill herself by setting herself on fire, and then she was actually prosecuted by the local authority for arson, and was put in a secure unit, like a forensic unit. And there's reasons why local authorities do that, but I know it probably sounds a bit brutal. So anyway, yeah, she ended up there. And then she was there for a year and a half, and she got out, and within 1 day of getting out and getting back home, she was sectioned under the Mental Health Act, hopefully something you've kind of covered, on top of a multi-storey car park, and then within 1 week of that, she was moved to something called a PQ, which is a psychiatric intensive care unit. A PQ is usually for people who have very serious psychosis. And it's usually for people, or it should be for people over the age of 18. Here we have someone at 17 and a half who was moved there. And the reason she was moved there is her self-injury was so severe at this point that she actually couldn't be left for a minute. And again, the self-injury, and again, I think of myself as a man of the world, but this girl was doing things that are indescribable. Her self-injury was just unbelievable. And she ended up in this PQ, just horrendous, at just 17 and a half. It's just, you can't even imagine this trajectory. And then, actually, after she got out, she then had a sort of very serious psychotic episode and ended up in hospital. and we'll talk about psychosis next week. But what a story, yeah? From like birth, you're put in this position, and I do see it that way. I'm not victimising her, but I'm saying we should perhaps see these people in those kind of ways. This is somebody who was abused so badly that this trajectory, sadly, because of a lack of intervention, was in some ways quite inevitable. This is not an uncommon story. This is what we are talking about when we talk about personality disorder. We're talking about this kind of level of distress. But what personality disorder is really about actually is something a bit different from that. These are the outward manifestations. This is the historical context. This is the kind of shocking self-injury and the rest of it. What personality disorder is really about is about problems with social relationships. This is what we want to get to. All this other stuff is just manifestations of one underlying issue, which is significant problems with social relationships. Now, lots of us have problems with social relationships, but we're talking about here where it is significantly distressing for the person involved and the person around them. The kind of stuff we're talking about here. I'm going to kind of skip over this quite quickly, but something to hold on to here, those of you who are kind of interested in more advanced thinking about this, is you can't actually just be diagnosed with a personality disorder. In DSM-4, it's on axis 2. I don't know if you've done this. We've got axis 1, which is clinical diagnosis, and axis 2 is personality. Oh, I don't know, you're looking a bit blank. Okay, let's just skip that. The point is you can't be diagnosed with personality disorder like you can with something like depression. You can be diagnosed with depression and personality disorder. You can be diagnosed with schizophrenia and personality disorder. Anorexia nervosa and personality disorder. You can't just be diagnosed with personality disorder. You kind of need one of those other things that it attaches to. And that's just through this weird quirk of how psychiatry kind of develops in its diagnosis. So you don't have to worry about that if you're not really interested. Personality disorder is a very stigmatised and stigmatising diagnosis. So it's, until recently, actually a label I don't think people would want, even if they have the level of difficulty we're talking there. There's this famous old joke among psychiatrists. What do you do with someone with personality disorder? Answer, you refer them. So, traditionally, it was thought that actually you can't treat these kinds of issues because they're so ingrained. Lots of research recently has shown that is not the case. Very intensive psychotherapy and a very structured provision can actually allow people to make very big gains if they're ready to make them. So that is a change in how these things are kind of thought about, and support options are now improving. In terms of PD itself, just like, you know, psychiatry is all about trees, isn't it? Trees of diagnoses, like different like labels here and different subheadings, and all that stuff that you did in week 2. Personality disorder divides down into 4 subclusters, and we're going to talk about just what the subclusters are. I know this is really confusing, but basically all of these things are just different names for slightly different manifestations of the same issue. In cluster B, you find reference to these 4 things: narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. None of these terms are particularly helpful. Just like all psychiatric diagnoses, they're just little bubbles, little clusters of behaviours that are associated with particular diagnostic names. I want to try and get past the diagnosis today, but we are going to talk about these 2 a bit. I've only got like 3 minutes left, but I might talk for another extra 2 minutes just so you get a bit more about it. Important thing about PD is that individuals rarely fit one of these perfectly. You tend to get people with bits of all of these, because what we're talking about is actually the manifestation of an underlying issue. We're not just talking about the surface. Let's quickly talk about borderline personality disorder. So this is the diagnostic kind of criteria, the way to think about how to classify someone as BPD. An important part of BPD seems to be that people who are diagnosed with this talk about very much a sense of instability, a sense of emptiness. They talk about feeling kind of devoid of meaning. Even they feel about kind of devoid of any kind of self. They just feel like, sometimes they describe them as things like sort of emotional vampires, just sort of walking around. They don't feel connected to anything around them. And a big part of this seems to be significant emotional instability and something called splitting. What splitting is the fancy name for very concrete black and white thinking. Everything's all brilliant, or it's all completely crap. This person's absolutely wonderful, or they're absolutely rubbish. It's actually a very immature emotional position. Little kids split all the time. Talk to a 3-year-old. Everything is black and white. However, a 30-year-old or 40-year-old, you should be able to see the shades of grey. You should know that not everyone is perfect or rubbish. Most people are somewhere in the middle. What people with BPD seem to experience is a lack of that. So because of that, all sorts of stuff happens. Like, they tend to be very impulsive individuals who do things quite shocking, big life changes. So, you just suddenly kind of give up your job and move to a completely different town, not knowing anyone there, because you kind of fancy it. Oh, we'll just have to do it in the dark. I don't know, it adds to the atmosphere, doesn't it? Like, intense and short-lived relationships. So again, when people with BPD have social relationships, which they do, they tend to be extremely intense. We talk about idealisation and devaluation, so they absolutely think a person's wonderful. But then at some point, invariably, it seems to flip, and then that person kind of becomes devalued and denigrated and rubbish. And it all seems to be about this splitting and this black and white thinking. And perhaps what it's really about is that in these short-lived, very intense, impulsive relationships, there's perhaps enough of feelings at the beginning of those relationships to make people with these issues kind of feel valued and validated. Because at the start of relationships, it is more intense, isn't it? Best bit of relationships. So many people say that's why there's so many serial monogamists. Just having relationships after relationships. It's the best first bit, the best, the exciting bit. In the exciting bit, you can idealise. You don't really know the person. It's fantastic. This person's everything I ever wanted. Of course, then you get to know people and you realise, that they pick their nose and that they're sometimes irritating, and actually they don't like this thing you really like. Now, hopefully, most of us in a mature position can deal with that, and that's what a nice long-term relationship's about. It's about the balance. It's not about devaluing. Say, well, actually, that person's not what I thought. I want to get rid of them. That's what we're kind of talking about here. But we're talking about this across a life. Now, all of us will have had experience of relationships like that. But we would hope not to have 40 years of those experiences, where every relationship goes that same way, round and round. Huge part of BPD then is also self-injury. Cutting is a big part. Other forms of self-injury as well. And linked to that, suicidal, parasuicidal behaviours. So parasuicidal behaviours are also known as suicidal gestures. So the idea is things that you do which look a bit like you might want to kill yourself, but perhaps aren't done for that precise reason. So my wife works as a probation officer and has several parasuicidal people on her caseload. And she has one guy in particular who his thing is to lie on the tram tracks. Okay, he goes and lies on the tram tracks, and then he rings people and says, "I'm lying on the tram tracks," and hangs up. So what do those people do? Well, they ring the police, and the police come. Flashing sirens, he gets moved off the tram tracks. He never kills himself. The tram never hits him. It's a parasuicidal behaviour. It's not about killing himself. It's about a gesture of killing himself. It's about what that evokes in other people. Perhaps we're starting to get to something here about what's at the centre of these kinds of issues. Also within BPD, you kind of have these periods, what's called dissociation. So that's points where, like if you're feeling really, really worried and you just can't concentrate and people talk to you and it's like you're in a bubble and you can't really focus. That feeling is dissociation. All of us know those feelings from when we're really tired or really worried or so forth. We don't normally have days of it. And that's kind of what we're talking here. It seems to be this sort of protective state that people with these issues can get themselves into. And this stuff, I don't like using the word comorbidity, but I'm going to. It co-occurs with all sorts of other things. People with these issues, surprise, surprise, tend to misuse a lot of substances. Not surprising when you kind of think of the level of distress that this stuff seems to be associated with. Also, problems with eating. I had no clinical psychologist who would say that every person with a diagnosis of an eating disorder actually has some of these issues, and that every person with a diagnosis of this has some issues with eating. They kind of fit together in a way that's quite troubling. Now, I really wanted to talk to you about antisocial personality disorder, but as always, I've talked for too long. So what I want to do is just finish off. You see the learning outcomes about just one personality disorder. You can read about more, and you should do, because it's a really interesting and challenging area. Well, what PD is beyond these behavioural